You can fly economy, Mom. Richard and I are up front. My daughter said it like she was telling me the weather. Not mean, not loud, just matter of fact. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. We were standing right there at the airport check-in desk. Bags on the floor, people rushing all around us. And for a second I thought maybe I had not heard her right. So I said, sorry, what was that? And Vivian just looked at me the way she looks at the woman at the dry cleaners when the order is slightly wrong. Patient but firm. There are only 2 seats in the premium cabin, she said. Richard reserved them months ago. She held up the boarding passes like she was showing me a perfectly reasonable spreadsheet. Hello, my loves. My name is Dorothy, and I am 72 years old. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. How many of you have ever been handed a decision that someone else already made for you, like your opinion was never part of the conversation? Because that is exactly what happened to me this morning. Now, I am not a woman who gets rattled easily. I raised 3 children, managed my own bookkeeping business for 27 years, once negotiated a lease agreement with a landlord who tried to double my rent mid-contract and won. I have sat in hospital waiting rooms alone and still found a way to be calm. I do not panic. But standing at that check-in counter with Vivian holding those 2 boarding passes for the premium seats and one very ordinary one for row 41, something shifted inside me. Not loudly, just quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep. The young woman behind the counter, she had soft brown eyes and a neat little braid pinned back. She looked at Vivian and then at me, and I could see in her face that she understood exactly what kind of moment this was. She kept her expression very professional, but her eyes were kind. Richard stood beside Vivian holding his carry-on strap with both hands. He gave me a polite nod. He always gives me that polite nod. The kind that says, I'm staying out of this, Dorothy. You two handle it. He had the unhurried look of a man who believed the morning was proceeding exactly as planned. This trip had not been planned last minute. We had been talking about it for 4 months. A week in Portugal. The Algarve coast, little white houses on cliff tops, fresh fish grilled with lemon and herbs, a boat tour along the caves that Vivian had been mentioning since last Christmas. She had practically organized every detail herself. The hotel, the restaurants, the transfers. And I had paid for most of it. Not because anyone asked me outright, but because that was how things had worked in our family for a long time. Vivian would describe something wonderful, and I would quietly make sure it happened. I looked at the boarding pass in my hand now. Row 41, seat C. Middle seat. The kind wedged between 2 strangers where you spend the whole flight trying not to accidentally touch the armrests. For a 9-hour flight. Vivian checked something on her phone, and added casually, it is honestly not that bad, Mom. The seats are perfectly comfortable. Just a few hours. Just a few hours. The trip was to Lisbon and then down to the Algarve. The flight was 9 hours. I had sat in row 41 once before on a flight to visit my sister in Dallas, and the man beside me fell asleep on my shoulder twice and watched a very loud football game on his phone with no earphones. I mention this only because it is relevant. I looked at Richard. He was reading something. On his phone now, completely relaxed, as if the conversation happening 2 feet away had nothing to do with him. Which I suppose, in the version of this story he had told himself, it did not. 2 months ago, Vivian called me on a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of chamomile tea and the newspaper. She said, Mom, Richard and I are going to Portugal in September and we want you to come with us. You need a vacation. And like a person who still believes those kinds of calls are simple, I said yes. Within a week, I had transferred money for the hotel deposit. Within 2 weeks, I had paid for all 3 flights. The whole booking start to finish on my credit card. 'Cause that was how it always worked. The luggage tags went on the bags. The airline agent printed them smoothly and arranged them on the belt. Priority handling, she said, for the premium passengers. Vivian and Richard's 2 large suitcases rolled forward. I noticed them right away. I had given Vivian those bags for her birthday 3 years ago. Dark green canvas with tan leather trim, the kind that travels well and lasts a long time if you take care of it. She had hugged me and said they were perfect. Mom, she added now, turning away from the counter, Your boarding group will be later than ours, so just come through when they call you. Just come through. Like we were two strangers who happened to be on the same route. Something happened inside me then. Not a crash, not an explosion. Something quieter than that. Like a shift in the weather before the rain. I looked at the boarding pass again. Row 41, seat C. And for the first time in a long while I saw something clearly. This trip was never about spending time together. I was the budget. I was the credit card and the wire transfer and the silent yes on the other end of the phone. I was the woman in row 41. I looked up slowly and asked in the gentlest voice I had, "Vivian," I said, "who booked this flight?" She blinked. "You did technically. Richard handled the details." I nodded slowly. "Issy." And I stepped back from the check-in counter. Not far. Just a few steps. But enough. The airport floor was all polished white tile. And under those big terminal lights, everything had that clean, bright look that makes the world seem very organized and orderly. I stood there holding the boarding pass. Row 41, seat C. I have flown enough in my life to know exactly what that means. 3 seats across in the last section of the plane, usually near the engines, where the noise does not stop for 9 hours. A middle seat means you have no window to look out and no aisle to stretch into. You are simply wedged. And the people on either side of you will both assume they own the armrest. I turned the paper over in my hand. Lisbon, Portugal. 4 months ago, when Vivian first mentioned the idea, she had sounded excited. She called me from her kitchen on a Sunday and said, "Mom, you would love the Algarve. The light there is like nothing else in Europe." She was right that I would love it. I had been to Portugal once, years ago, with my late husband Frank. We had walked cobblestone streets and eaten pastries standing outside a little bakery at 7 in the morning. It was one of the most peaceful weeks of my life. I had agreed to this trip partly for that reason. And partly because of my grandson, Oliver. He was 12 and visiting for 2 weeks this summer. And Vivian had mentioned that maybe Oliver would join us toward the end of the trip. Oliver noticed things. He was the kind of child who asked me what the stamps in my old passport meant and whether I had ever been scared on a plane and what my favorite country was. When children ask you questions like that, it means they are actually listening. I looked back toward the check-in counter. Vivian was saying something to Richard, and they were both smiling slightly. The green suitcases, my gift to her, sat perfectly upright on the belt waiting to be loaded. Neither of them had looked over to check on me. I slipped my hand into my handbag and found my phone. People sometimes assume that a woman my age struggles with technology. Find this amusing. When you have run a bookkeeping business for nearly 3 decades, worked with accounting software since before most people had home computers, and once filed a tax dispute entirely by email, a banking app is no challenge at all. I opened it calmly. There it was. The airline charge from 4 months ago. 3 passengers, New York to Lisbon. The number was not small. Richard had clearly taken his time choosing the seats. I studied the booking details for a moment. Then I opened the reservation page. 3 passengers, 3 seats. Everything laid out very neatly. Vivian Hartley, premium cabin. Richard Hartley, premium cabin. Dorothy Marsh, economy. Row 41, seat C. I exhaled slowly through my nose. There is something about seeing your own name at the bottom of a list like that, under a heading that says economy, while the 2 people you paid for are listed above under premium. It has a certain clarity to it. Like a sentence in a book you have read 3 times before but only now understood. I looked up across the terminal. Vivian was chatting with Richard now, laughing at something. She looked perfectly at ease. They both did. The complete ease of 2 people who had not considered even briefly whether the arrangement might be worth questioning. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Precision. The airport hummed around me. A coffee machine behind a nearby cafe counter made a long, rich grinding sound. A little boy nearby sat on his father's suitcase eating crackers, crumbs dropping onto the polished floor. 2 women in matching travel jackets studied something on a shared phone. Life, in all its ordinary detail, continued moving. And there I stood with my phone open to a booking I had paid for in full, thinking something I had been avoiding for a long time. I pressed Modify Reservation. The page loaded slowly, as if giving me a moment to think. A short list of options appeared. Change seat. Luggage. Cancel passenger. I stood very still for a moment. I had a habit, a long and well-practiced one, of talking myself down from decisions like this. Of finding a reasonable explanation for things. Of telling myself that everyone was tired or stressed or just thoughtless, not unkind. I had used that voice many times. It was the same voice that convinced me to help with the down payment on Vivian and Richard's house 6 years ago. The same voice that said of course when Vivian asked me to cover Oliver's private school registration fees because the timing was difficult. The same voice that told me family takes care of family, Dorothy, and that generosity is its own reward. That voice had been very persuasive over the years. I looked at the options on the screen. Cancel passenger. The cafe nearby smelled of warm pastry and fresh espresso. Somewhere down the terminal a child was laughing, that bright, uncomplicated sound that echoes through big spaces. And the voice inside me that usually said let it go, Dorothy, do not make a fuss, that voice was very quiet this morning. Almost absent. My thumb hovered over the option. Renames. Vivian Hartley. Richard Hartley. Dorothy Marsh. I looked at them for a moment. Then I selected Vivian Hartley. Confirmation box appeared. Cancel this passenger from the booking. The screen waited. A group of students in matching university sweatshirts wheeled past me, all of them talking at once. A man in a business suit nearly walked into a luggage cart and apologized to no one. An announcement echoed something about a gate change in Terminal C. The airport paid no attention to what I was doing, which was fine. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed quietly. Vivian Hartley. Booking cancelled. And for a few seconds I simply stood there in the middle of all that ordinary airport noise, holding my phone, feeling something I had not expected. Complete and total calm. The kind of calm that comes when you have finally done the thing you knew needed doing. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked out through the tall windows at the tarmac below. A plane was reversing slowly away from the gate, its engines building from a low hum into something steadier. I watched it for a moment. Then across the terminal I heard Vivian say, Ethan, something is wrong with my boarding pass. I had not moved. I just stood near the window and waited. Because I already knew what she was reading. Vivian looked at her phone with the expression she gets when something does not compute. A slight frown, a small tightening around the eyes. She looked at it once, then again, then held it toward Richard. He leaned in and read it. His posture changed immediately. That small stiffening of the shoulders that people do when something they believed was settled turns out not to be settled at all. Vivian looked up from the phone and began scanning the terminal. When she found me standing near the window, she looked almost puzzled for a moment. Like she had not expected me to still be there. Then she walked toward me and Richard followed behind. She moved with that careful, measured pace she always uses when she is keeping her feelings controlled. I watched them come. I did not move. When she reached me, she held up the phone. Mom, she said quietly, my ticket is cancelled. Yes, I said. You know. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean, you know? I mean I cancelled it. She stared at me. You cancelled my ticket. Richard stepped forward with the practiced calm of a man who handles negotiations. Dorothy, he said, his voice very reasonable, there must be some sort of error in the system. We can get this sorted. No, I said. There is no error. Vivian blinked. Why would you do that? She asked. The question was quiet, but behind it was something tighter. I tilted my head just slightly and looked at her. Vivian, I said, you put me in row 41. Middle seat. On a 9-hour flight. She opened her mouth. That's not the point, she said. Continued gently. It was entirely the point, I replied. Richard cleared his throat. Now Evelyn, look. Dorothy, I said. He paused. Dorothy, he corrected. We understand this feels unexpected. We can sort out the seats at the desk. Airlines have upgrade options. I looked at him for a moment. Richard was a man. who moved through the world as if all obstacles were administrative and all administrators were reasonable. In his professional life, I imagine this served him very well. In this particular situation, it was less useful. I said the seat was not the only thing. Vivian's eyes sharpened. Then what? I asked her quietly. Do you know who paid for your ticket? A pause. You did. Do you know who paid for the hotel? Another small pause. Do you know who paid for the transfers and the dinner reservations and the wine tour Vivian mentioned back in July? Vivian did not answer immediately. Richard shifted his weight slightly. I nodded gently. So did I. And I placed you in the premium cabin and myself in row 41. She crossed her arms. That is not what I did, she said. It is exactly what happened, I replied. That's not the same thing. I did not argue with her on that point. She was right technically. She had not made a conscious decision to be unkind. She had simply not thought about it at all. And that, I had come to understand this morning, was the real issue. I stepped back slightly from the window. I'm going to head home, I said. Vivian's arms dropped. What? I picked up my handbag and settled the strap over my shoulder. The hotel was booked under my name, I added. So you may want to sort that out. Richard said, Wait, Evelyn. Dorothy, I said. He closed his eyes briefly. Dorothy, we can fix this. The seats can be adjusted. I looked at him calmly. I know they can, I said. But I am not going. Vivian stared at me as if I had just announced something in a foreign language. You cannot just leave, she said. The words came out somewhere between confused and alarmed. She had the expression of someone who had just realized the floor beneath them might not be where they expected. I looked at her steadily and said something I had not planned but which felt entirely true. Vivian, I said, you were going to leave me behind without thinking about it twice. She opened her mouth. I said the thing about your seat. Yes, I said. And you did. I turned and walked toward the terminal exit. The automatic doors were ahead of me, and through the glass I could see the pale morning sky and the row of taxis and the ordinary busy world outside. Behind me I heard Vivian say Mom, just once, not loudly, in a tone I had not heard from her in a very long time. But I kept walking, because sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is stop pretending that everything is fine when everything is not. I stepped outside and the morning air came in all at once, cool and clean and smelling of fuel and coffee from a cart near the taxi stand. The sun was still low, throwing long pale light across the pavement. I stood for a moment and just breathed. Airports are strange places when you have decided not to fly. The whole rushing urgency of everyone around you becomes very quiet, like watching a river from the bank instead of standing in it. My phone had already begun buzzing in my bag. I did not open it immediately. I stood by the taxi line and watched a plane climb slowly above the terminal building, banking left over the city and disappearing into a thin stripe of cloud. For a moment I thought about Frank, my husband. He had loved to watch planes take off. He always said every departure looks like something beginning. I used to think he was being poetic. Now I understood he was simply right. My phone buzzed again. I opened it this time. 2 missed calls from Vivian, 1 text message. Mom, what is going on? Come back inside. Then another right behind it. This is not funny, Dorothy. I read both messages and put the phone back in my bag without answering. A taxi driver near the front of the line caught my eye and nodded toward his car. In a moment I told him. He nodded and leaned back against the door. The morning traffic around the airport had started to pick up. Cars pulling in and out, horns. Occasionally in the distance, the rolling sound of wheels on pavement. Then my phone buzzed once more. This time it was a text from Richard. Dorothy, the hotel reservation is under your name. I suspect there may be an issue if you are not checking in. I read that message twice. Then I allowed myself a very small smile. Yes, I thought. That is correct. 3 months earlier, when I booked the hotel in the Algarve, the woman on the phone had been wonderfully helpful. A cliff-top property, with sea views and a garden restaurant that served grilled sardines and a dessert involving local honey and something called quejadas that I had been looking forward to trying. I had booked the suite on the top floor because Vivian had pointed at a photo of it and said, "Oh Mom, that one is gorgeous." So I had booked it and paid the deposit and put everything under my name. The transfers from Lisbon, the boat tour, the table at a recommended restaurant on the third evening. All of it connected to the same card. My phone buzzed again. "Vivian, did you cancel the hotel too?" I had not. Not yet. But I was standing outside thinking about it very carefully. I looked at a taxi idling 2 spots from the front of the line. The driver was drinking from a paper cup, watching people come and go with the patient expression of someone who has seen everything an airport can produce. Behind me, the terminal doors slid open and another wave of travelers stepped out into the morning. I was not yet ready to leave. Not entirely. And about 30 seconds later I discovered why. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Oliver, my grandson. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma." He sounded slightly out of breath. "Mom called me and she was asking if you were still at the airport." I looked back at the terminal. The glass walls were bright in the morning light, reflecting everything and showing nothing. "Yes," I said. "I am still here." He paused. "Did something happen?" I considered that question the way you consider questions from people you love, carefully, honestly. "Something happened, yes," I said. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Through the phone I could hear the sound of his house, some music playing somewhere softly, what might have been a television, the ordinary sounds of a morning at home. "Did Mom do something?" he asked. His voice was careful. The way 12-year-olds sound when they already suspect the answer and are hoping they are wrong. I said, "It is a bit complicated to explain right now, Oliver." He thought about that. Then he said, "Was it about the seats on the plane?" I blinked. "What do you know about the seats?" He hesitated. "I heard her talking to Dad last night. They were in the kitchen." He spoke more quietly now. "She said it did not matter where you sat because you would be asleep most of the flight anyway." I stood very still for a moment. The airport noise continued around me. Car honked. Wheels rattled on pavement. That was what she had said. "You will be asleep most of the flight anyway." As if the question of where a 72-year-old woman sat for 9 hours, the woman who had paid for the entire trip, was simply a logistical afterthought. Oliver said quietly, "I did not think that was right." I said, "It is all right, sweetheart." "No, it is not," he said very simply. And something about hearing a 12-year-old say that so plainly and so directly made something tighten in my chest in the way that only the most honest things can. I said, "How are you doing this morning, Oliver?" He said, "I am fine. I was going to call you before the flight anyway." I said, "Why?" He paused. "I wanted to say I hope you have a really good time. That you see the caves and the ocean and all the stuff you told me you saw with Grandpa Frank." Another tightening in my chest, warmer this time. I told him that was very kind of him. He said, "Grandma, are you still going?" I looked toward the terminal behind me. Inside somewhere, Vivian and Richard were standing at a counter or on their phones trying to untangle a situation that was not going to untangle the way they hoped. Because the person who made it all possible had stepped outside and was standing in the morning air not entirely sure what came next. "Not today," I told Oliver. He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay. I think I understand." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Kind of. You are not going because they did not treat you right." I said something like that, "Yes." He said, "Then I think you are doing the right thing." For a 12-year-old. He had a very clear view of things. I thanked him and told him I would call him later and that I loved him. He said, "I love you too, Grandma." And then he said one more thing before he hung up. He said, "Next time I will come with you to Portugal. Tell me when." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud there in the airport drop-off lane. A rail laugh and a taxi driver nearby glanced over with a mildly curious look. I put my phone back in my bag and stood quietly for a moment. The laugh had been unexpected. But it had also been necessary. Because something about Oliver saying that so simply and so completely sincerely had just put the entire morning into very clear perspective. I was not a woman who was falling apart. I was not a woman who had been broken by a boarding pass. I was a woman who had just been reminded by a 12-year-old that she was worth a proper seat on a plane. And that is not a small thing. I looked toward the road. The taxis continued their steady rhythm. The morning light had shifted slightly, getting warmer and more golden as the sun climbed. I had made a decision inside the terminal, but I was not in any particular rush to leave. Part of me, the part that had spent 50 years caring about what people thought and whether things were comfortable and whether everyone was all right, that part was still listening for the doors to open. And they did. Vivian came through the terminal doors about 2 minutes later with Richard behind her. She moved quickly this time. Not with the controlled, measured pace from before. Quickly, which told me a great deal about what they had discovered in the last 20 minutes. She came right toward me, and when she reached me she said, "Mom, the hotel will not honor the booking without you." "I know," I said. She exhaled sharply. "You cannot just leave," she said. "The hotel deposit is already paid." "Yes," I said. "It is. And if you do not check in, they keep it." "That is also correct," I told her. She stared at me. "You are willing to lose that money?" I looked at her quietly. "I have spent more than that on things I got nothing back from," I said. She did not have an answer to that. Richard stepped in with his reasonable voice. "Dorothy, let us all just slow down and have a sensible conversation. The suite can probably be transferred to another name. If we explain the situation," I said, "you are welcome to call them and try." He nodded as if this was progress. I added, "But I will not be authorizing it." He stopped nodding. Vivian's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because," I said simply, "that is not something I am willing to do today." She shook her head. "This is about the seat." I said, "It is about more than the seat, Vivian." She crossed her arms. "Then tell me what it is about." I looked at her for a moment. The morning had moved past that particular kind of sharp, anxious energy of arriving at an airport. Now it had the different quality of something that had already been missed. Gates closing somewhere. People already through security. The business of the morning moving on without us. I said, "Do you know how many times I have written a check or made a transfer because you needed something?" She frowned. "We always paid you back." I did not say anything to that. After a moment she said, "Most of it." I kept my expression very calm. She said, "Do you remember when Richard's investment situation collapsed 3 years ago?" She looked slightly uncomfortable. "You said you were happy to help." I said. "And the house deposit?" "You offered," she said, her voice rising just a fraction. "And the school fees for Oliver." He paused. "We said we would sort those out." "I know," I said. "And you will. Sometime." She looked at Richard. He was studying the ground. She looked back at me. "This feels like an ambush," she said. I shook my head. Gently. "No," I said. "An ambush would have been me not telling you anything and just leaving. I'm still here." She blinked. "Then what is this?" "This," I said, "is me telling you clearly for possibly the first time that things are going to be different." Richard looked up from the ground. He said quietly, "What does that mean, Dorothy?" I said, "It means I will not keep writing checks for a life that puts me in row 41. For a moment no one spoke. The cars around us came and went. A family pushed past us with 4 bags and a stroller, moving fast toward the entrance. Vivian looked at me with an expression I did not see from her very often. Uncertainty. Not the surface kind. The deeper kind, where a person realizes the solid thing they have been standing on might not be as solid as they believed. She said, "I did not think about it like that." "I know," I said. "That is part of the problem." She opened her mouth and then closed it again. Richard said carefully, "You really are not coming." "No," I said. "And you are not fixing the hotel." "Well." He thought for a moment. "Is there anything we can say that would change your mind?" Thought about that. It was a fair question, and Richard, whatever his other qualities, was usually fair. I said, "You could tell me honestly whether either of you thought, even for a moment, about putting me in the premium cabin and one of you in economy." A long pause followed. Richard and Vivian looked at each other. That look was its own answer. I nodded slowly. "Then there is nothing to change," I said. Vivian said, "This is not how I thought this morning would go." "I imagine not," I replied. She looked at the airport behind her, then back at me. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. She said, "We still have time to fix the seats if you want to come." I looked at her carefully. What I was looking for was whether she meant it. Whether she understood. what she was actually offering, or whether she was still thinking primarily about the hotel deposit and the trip. I could not be entirely sure. I said, I appreciate that. But my answer is still no. She pressed her lips together. Ethan looked at his watch. Vivian, he said. We need to decide. She looked at him. She looked at me. She looked at the terminal. I could see her mind working through it. The money already spent. The hotel with no check-in. The seats in the premium cabin. That were now half useful. All of it balanced against the image she had carried for 4 months of a perfect family trip along the Portuguese coast. I did not feel satisfaction watching this. That is not the right word for it. What I felt was something closer to sadness. Not for myself. For her. Because Vivian was not a cruel woman. She was an oblivious one. And sometimes obliviousness costs more than cruelty in the end. Because at least cruelty knows what it is doing. She said finally, you are making this very difficult. Said, I know. She said, we cannot use the hotel without you. I said, I know that too. She said, the deposit is nearly $4,000. Said, I am aware. She looked at me with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something in between. She said, this feels like punishment. Said, it is not. She said, then what is it? I looked at her quietly and said what I had been thinking all morning. It is a boundary, I said. Vivian blinked. She looked at me as if I had used a word she recognized from somewhere but had never expected to hear from me. Richard was very quiet beside her. I said, I have helped this family for a long time. Willingly. Gladly most of the time. But there has to be something in return. Not money. Not repayment. Just respect. Vivian said nothing. I said, and this morning at that counter, I did not feel respected. Her jaw moved slightly. She said, I was just being practical about the seats. I said, I understand that is how you saw it. She said, I was not trying to hurt you. I know, I said. And I am not trying to punish you. I'm just being honest about where things stand. Richard said slowly, so what happens now? I said, that is really a question for the two of you. He looked at Vivian. She looked at the terminal. The morning continued around us as mornings do, not caring about any particular family's reckoning. She said quietly, if we go, we lose the hotel deposit. I did not respond to that. She said, and if we do not go, we lose the flights. Said yes. She said, either way we lose money. I said, I am afraid so. She looked at me with an expression that was still working through itself, still somewhere between resentment and something more honest. She said, I want you to know that I did not intend for this morning to go this way. Said, I believe you. She said, does that matter? I thought about that for a moment. Taxi pulled up to the curb. A man in a gray coat helped an elderly woman with a cane into the back seat, and then loaded 2 small bags into the trunk with the careful attention of someone who was clearly her son. I watched them for just a second. Then I said, it matters. But it does not change what I have decided. Vivian exhaled slowly. Richard put his hands in his pockets. The 3 of us stood in a row facing the road, which is a strange formation for a conversation. Like we were all watching for something to arrive. Richard said finally, is this about more than the trip? Said yes. He nodded as if he had expected that. Vivian said, how long have you been feeling this way? Said a while. She said, you never said anything. I said, I tried once or twice. She looked at me. I do not remember that. Said, I know. She looked down at the pavement. That said something to her that I had not needed to put into words. Richard said, I think I owe you an apology, Dorothy. I looked at him. He seemed genuine. He said, I did not question the seat arrangement this morning. I should have. Said, yes, you should have. He nodded. Simple as that. No defense, no explanation. Just yes, you are right. I had not expected that from him. Did not fix anything. But it was honest, and honesty at least I could work with. Vivian was quiet. She had been looking at the traffic for the last half minute. And I could not read her face entirely. Then she said, I always thought you liked being helpful. Said, I do. She said, so I thought. I said, there is a difference between being helpful and being taken for granted. And then I added, even when the person doing it loves you. She turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes were different now. Not the composed, efficient eyes from inside the terminal. Something younger. Something that looked almost startled, like a child who has just realized that another person has feelings they were not aware of. She said quietly, "I did take you for granted." Waited. She said, "I think I have been doing it for a while." Said yes. She said, "I am sorry, Mom. Now, I want to be careful here because I have seen too many stories where a person says sorry once and everything dissolves back into the same patterns as before. A word, however sincere, is not the same thing as a change. And I was 72 years old and I had learned that lesson in the way you only learn it when you have lived long enough. So I said, "I hear you." She said, I said, "But today I am still going home." She looked at me. She said, "Will you come on another trip?" I said, "I do not know yet." She nodded once, slowly. That was a more honest answer than yes would have been, and she seemed to understand it. Richard said, "What would you need from us to get there?" It was a good question. Specific one. I said, "I would need to feel like I was a person on the trip, not the reason the trip was possible." He said, "What does that look like?" I said, "It looks like being asked which seat I want. It looks like someone else's card on the hotel deposit. It looks like being in the conversation about what we do each day, not just the person who funds it." Vivian and Richard looked at each other. Not with the smooth alignment they usually carried. This was a different kind of looking. The kind where two people are both realizing simultaneously that something in their life has been running on an assumption that they never examined. Richard said, "That is reasonable." Vivian said, "It is." She said it quietly, but she said it. And coming from Vivian, who rarely conceded anything before 10 in the morning, that was something. Said, "Good." I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and looked at the road. A taxi had moved to the front of the line. The driver looked up at me questioningly. I held up one finger. "One moment." He settled back. Vivian said, "So where does this leave us right now?" I said, "I think it leaves you with a decision about whether to go to Portugal, and it leaves me with a taxi." She looked at me for a second and then, unexpectedly, she made a sound. Not a laugh exactly. Something between a laugh and an exhale. The kind of sound you make when something is too true to be entirely funny and too absurd to be entirely sad. She said, "You are the most stubborn woman I know." I said, "You know where you got it from?" Richard smiled at that. Just briefly. But it was a real smile. For a moment, the three of us stood there in something that was not exactly comfortable and not exactly resolved but was at least honest. Which was more than we had started the morning with. Vivian said, "If we go, the hotel issue is still a problem." Said, "I know." She said, "Is there anything you can do?" I said, "I will think about it." That was not a yes and she knew it. But it was also not a final no. She looked at me carefully. "That is the most I am getting right now, isn't it?" I said, "For today, yes." She pressed her lips together again. Then she said something I appreciated. She said, "Okay." Just that. No argument. No further negotiation. I looked at her. She looked like herself but slightly different. As if something that had been drawn tight all morning had loosened very slightly. Not fully, but enough. Richard said, "I hope you get home safely, Dorothy." I said, "Thank you, Richard." He nodded. Vivian said, "Will you call me when you get in?" Said yes. She said, "And you will think about the hotel?" I said, "I will think about it." She said, "That is not a yes." Said, "No, it is not." She exhaled once more. Then she turned back toward the terminal. Richard followed beside her. I watched them walk back through the sliding doors. At the last moment before they went inside, Vivian turned back and looked at me. She did not say anything. Neither did I. But the look was different from the one she had given me at the check-in counter. That one had been administrative. This one was something else. I turned to the taxi at the front of the line. The driver opened the door without me asking. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. Got in. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and the airport began to shrink in the window behind me. For a few minutes, I simply sat and watched the road. The highway outside the airport is not a beautiful stretch of road. It is wide and functional and lined with warehouses and signage. But the sky above it that morning was quite something. The kind of sky you get in late September when the air is clean and the light is angled low and the blue is deep enough to seem almost significant. I watched it and let my thoughts settle the way thoughts do when the adrenaline of a long morning begins to ease. I thought about Vivian at 12, reorganizing her bedroom drawers with a label maker she had asked for as a birthday present, everything sorted and named and accounted for. I thought about her at 24, calling me from her first apartment 2 days after moving in to report that the cupboard door was hanging wrong and the landlord was not responding quickly enough. Her voice perfectly controlled and slightly outraged. I thought about her at 31 when Oliver was born and she held him with such careful intensity that I had to look away because it made my heart hurt in that particular way that only happens when you love someone and they are finally showing you something true about themselves. I thought about all the ways she was mine and all the ways she had slowly stopped seeing me as anything more than a very reliable resource. And I thought about how those two things could both be completely true at the same time, which is one of the harder lessons of being a parent, loving someone and also needing to stop absorbing the cost of being invisible to them. My phone buzzed. I looked at it. Text from Vivian. We are going to go. I think we need to sort the hotel thing ourselves. I will call them and explain. I looked at that for a moment. Then I typed back, good. I hope it works out. A minute passed. Then she wrote, Mom, I meant what I said back there. I know I type. Another pause. Then I am going to do better. I read that 4 times. Not because I doubted she meant it, but because I was trying to understand what exactly she was promising. Whether she knew what it would look like in practice, in the ordinary daily ways that matter more than big declarations. Typed, I know you will try. She sent a single heart, small and red. I looked at it for a moment, then put the phone in my lap. The taxi moved through traffic. The driver had the radio on. Low, something instrumental, the kind of quiet music that suits early mornings. I looked out at the city as we entered it, buildings and bridges and the river catching the light. I had lived in this city for 40 years. Frank and I had moved here when Vivian was 3 and set up the business from a single room above a dry cleaner's on a street that later became fashionable. I had watched the city change around me and I had changed with it or around it, or in spite of it depending on the year. My phone buzzed again. Oliver this time. Grandma. Yes, I replied. Mom texted me. She said you are going home. Said yes. He said I am glad you did what you felt was right. I smiled at that. I said thank you, sweetheart. He said also I looked up flights to Lisbon. I laughed. Put the phone down, Oliver. He sent back a laughing face and then a tiny plane. I shook my head, still smiling. The taxi turned onto a street I recognized, and the neighborhood settled around us with the familiar ease of somewhere that belongs to you. Trees along the pavement, a cafe I had been going to for 15 years, the baker on the corner whose name I knew, the dry cleaners run by a family who always remembered my coat. Not a destination so much as a fact. The driver pulled up outside my building and I paid him and thanked him and he said have a good day, ma'am, and I said I intend to. I went upstairs and set my bag on the hall table and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The apartment was quiet and it was mine. Put the kettle on. There is something about putting the kettle on. It is such a small gesture, and yet it is entirely about caring for yourself. The decision to stop and make something warm just for you. I stood by the window while the water heated and looked down at the street. People going about their mornings. A woman with a dog. A man on a bicycle. 2 children with school bags arguing about something. The ordinary procession of a day. I thought about Portugal. The white houses. Caves. The sea. I had wanted to go for a long time. Not because Vivian had suggested it, but because Frank and I had spoken about going back someday and someday had not arrived before it stopped being possible. There would be another time. Perhaps in spring when the light was different. Perhaps with Oliver as he had proposed so directly and so sincerely from his kitchen with music playing somewhere in the background. The kettle clicked. I made a pot of tea, the good kind, loose leaf, the kind that takes a few minutes and rewards you for the patience. I brought it to the table by the window and sat down. My phone was face up beside the pot. I looked at it and then I turned it face down. Not because I was avoiding anyone. Just because the morning had been long and the tea was ready. And there was something to be said for a few minutes of silence when you have earned them. I thought about what I had said to Vivian. I will think about it. The hotel. The suite with the sea view. The restaurant with the sardines. The clifftop garden. All of it sitting in the Algarve waiting for someone to show up. And I thought about whether I wanted to make a call and smooth it over. Whether I wanted to call the hotel and authorize Vivian's check-in. From my kitchen in New York while she flew the premium cabin route I had purchased with my own money. And I decided that I did not want to do that today. Not out of spite. Just out of honesty. Because if I did it today, by tomorrow everything would be reset to the familiar arrangement. Vivian's voice would soften on the phone the way it always did after a conflict. And I would be glad because I wanted her to be happy. And then 3 months from now, there would be another trip or another investment situation or another school fee or another thing where my contribution was assumed and my preferences were managed around. And I would be sitting at a different counter with a different boarding pass and the same quiet feeling of having made myself very small so that everyone else could be comfortable. I was too old for that. 72 years old and too old for it. I drank my tea. Outside the window the sky had shifted to a clearer and warmer blue. My phone, face down on the table, buzzed once. I did not reach for it immediately. I let the buzz fade. Then I turned it over. It was not Vivian. It was a text from my friend Marjorie. She had been in Lisbon herself 2 years ago on a trip with her book club. She had sent a photo once of a tram going up a steep hill in golden evening light, and I had saved it. She had texted now out of what seemed like coincidence, though at 72 you stop being entirely sure what is coincidence. She said, "Thinking of you this morning, Dorothy. Are you well?" I wrote back, "Yes, more than I expected to be." She replied, "Tea or trouble?" Said both. She sent back a laughing face and then, "Call me this evening." I set the phone down and smiled properly for the second time that morning. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge and regarded me briefly with the complete indifference that pigeons alone have truly mastered. I looked at it, looked at me, left. I finished my tea. I thought about Oliver saying, "Next time I will come with you. Tell me when." I thought about him looking up flights from his kitchen while his mother was probably somewhere over the Atlantic, by now beginning to understand that a 9-hour flight gives you quite a lot of time to sit with things. I hoped she would use that time. I hoped she would arrive in Lisbon looking at things differently. Not just the light, which was supposed to be extraordinary, but the ordinary human facts of the people around her. The way she looked at Richard. The way she would look at Oliver when he visited. The way she might eventually learn to look at me. Not as a resource. Not as the woman who smoothed things over and made deposits and sat quietly in the back of the plane. But as a person. Her mother. Someone who had given her everything she needed to build a good life and who only asked in return to be treated as if that counted for something. I rinsed my cup at the sink. I stood for a moment in the kitchen with my hands resting on the edge of the counter, looking at nothing in particular, just breathing in the quiet. My apartment, my kitchen, my life, still standing, still mine. I went to my desk and found the journal I had kept for 20 years. I opened it to a new page and wrote the date. Then I wrote one sentence. Today I sat in my own kitchen with good tea, and I was not ashamed of a single decision I made this morning. Closed the journal. I stood up. I thought about what I would do with the rest of the day. Not in the anxious way of someone trying to fill a space, but in the easy way of someone who has the whole afternoon ahead of them and no obligation to spend it apologizing for anything. Could call Marjorie. Could take a walk. I could find the folder of photos from the trip Frank and I took years ago and look at the ones from Lisbon. I could do nothing at all. The freedom in that was not a small thing. My phone buzzed once more. I looked. It was Vivian. We landed in Lisbon okay. Hotel sorted it. Richard handled it. Then a pause. Then one more message. I had a lot of time to think on the flight, Mom. I read that and sat with it for a moment. I typed back, "I am glad." She wrote, "Can we talk when I get home?" I wrote yes. She sent one more message. "I want to do this differently." I looked at those 5 words for a long time. I want to do this differently. Not "I am sorry," though she had said that too. Not the polished apology of someone managing a situation, but the simpler and harder thing. Desire for change. Whether that desire would survive landing and customs and the familiar rhythms of life back home, I could not know for certain. I had been around long enough to know that intentions at 30,000 feet do not always make it all the way back to ground level. But I also knew that some of them do. And that the ones that do tend to arrive after a person has been forced, by some unexpected and inconvenient reckoning, to sit with an honest picture of themselves for a while. Vivian had that picture now. She was looking at it. That was something. I typed back, I want that too. I put the phone down and stood by the window. Again. The street below had the unhurried look of a mid-morning on a weekday. The cafe across the road had people at the outside table now. 2 women with coffee and something that looked like newspapers. The dog walker had come back around the block. The man on the bicycle had been replaced by a different man on a different bicycle. Everything as it always was. The world having no particular opinion about the fact that my family had been rearranged somewhat at an airport this morning. Life is like that. It does not pause to acknowledge the moments when something shifts. The kettle does not know. The street does not know. Only you know. And you carry it with you quietly the way you carry everything that matters, not in a way that other people can necessarily see, but in the way it sits in your chest and changes the angle at which you look at things from then on. I thought about the Algarve Hotel sitting empty, or perhaps not empty now if Richard had managed to sort it. I thought about the garden restaurant and the sardines. I thought about the boat tour through the sea caves that Vivian had been talking about for months. I was a little sad to miss it. I will tell you that honestly. There was a version of this morning I would have preferred where none of this had been necessary. Where Vivian had looked up from those boarding passes at the check-in counter and said, "Actually, Mom, take my seat." Where Richard had thought to ask. Where I had not needed to stand by a tall terminal window pressing confirm on a cancellation that nobody had made necessary except the 2 people who benefited most from pretending I had no preferences. But that version had not happened. And the version that had happened had its own kind of value. Because I had stood in an airport this morning and chosen myself. Quietly, without drama, without cruelty, without shouting or weeping or making the kind of scene that Vivian had warned me against. I had simply pressed a button and picked up my bag and walked outside into the morning. And I had meant it. And now I was home with good tea and a quiet kitchen and a phone with 3 honest messages from my daughter, who was somewhere over Europe looking out a window and thinking about things she had not thought about before. That was not nothing. In fact, it was a great deal. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Oliver again. Answered. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma," he said, slightly breathless, like he had been thinking about calling for 20 minutes and finally decided to just do it. "I wanted to check on you." "I am completely well," I told him. He said, "I was kind of worried." I said, "There is nothing to worry about." He said, "I told Mom in a text that I thought she should apologize." Said Oliver. He said, "I know. She is my mom. But you are my grandma and you are important." I sat down in the chair by the window again. I said, "You know what, sweetheart? You are a remarkable boy." He said, "Dad says I am too serious." I said, "Your father is an accountant. Take that with appropriate context." He laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that makes you feel the person on the other end of the phone is entirely present. I said, "Oliver, when do you want to go to Portugal?" He said, "Whenever you say, Grandma. You are in charge of that trip." I am in charge of that trip. For words I had not heard this entire morning until right now. Said by a 12-year-old boy eating breakfast at his kitchen table with music playing somewhere in the background. I said, "We will go in the spring when the jacaranda trees are out." He said, "What are jacaranda trees?" I said, "They are the most beautiful purple trees in the world and they bloom in spring in Lisbon along certain streets, and if you walk under them at the right moment, you feel as though you are inside a painting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am definitely going." Smiled. I told him I would plan it. He said, "Tell me what to save up for and I will save." Said, "Not a penny. This one is on me." He started to protest. Said Oliver. He stopped. I said, "This trip, you and me." He said, "Yes, Grandma." I said, "I will book us the best seats on the plane." He laughed again. We talked for a few more minutes and then he had to go because school was starting. After we hung up I sat for a long time in the quiet. Outside the window the sky was blue and wide and going about its business. Somewhere across the Atlantic, a plane was carrying my daughter toward a country I loved. And here in my kitchen I had a spring trip to plan, and a reason to plan it, and a boy who said you are in charge. People ask me sometimes what I think the most important lesson of getting older is. Here it is. Know your worth. Not loudly. Not as an argument. Just quietly, completely, and early enough to still enjoy what you get for it. If this story stayed with you, please leave me a comment. I always read them. And if you are new here, welcome. I am Dorothy and this is Granny's Voice. Please subscribe so you never miss a story.